The final bite paradox. In many cultures, there's a deeply rooted habit of setting aside the best part of a dish for last, as though that final bite could encapsulate all the pleasure. It might be the juiciest slice of meat, the most heavily filled corner of a dessert, or the most appealing section of a pizza. The logic behind such behavior relies on the hope that this supreme moment at the end will bring an intense payoff, yet it contains a paradox. By obsessing over that final instant, we risk overlooking or even neglecting the rest of the process, thereby reducing our overall enjoyment. The paradox becomes especially evident when, upon reaching this famed last bite, it fails to live up to the fantasy that's been building. The diner, having avoided that central portion of the cake or that particularly succulent piece of meat, finally takes that awaited mouthful only to discover it's not as extraordinary as imagined, or perhaps their taste buds are already somewhat saturated. What was supposed to offer unparalleled delight ends up merely good, but not as transcendent as conjured by the mind. Sometimes, even if the culminating mouthful is amazing, one realizes how the other pieces were sacrificed in the process. The person avoided fully enjoying the rest in a bid to save that special part, eating everything else more mechanically. Consequently, the focal point that was meant to heighten the experience ends up diluting it overall. It's striking how this pattern repeats in other facets of life. Think of planning a vacation, where someone invests all their budget and energy into a final big day and treats the earlier days as mere warm-ups. Or consider an event organizer who pours nearly all resources into a spectacular fireworks show at the very end, while the rest of the party remains somewhat lackluster. When the climactic moment arrives, it may indeed be dazzling, yet it hardly compensates for hours of lukewarm ambience leading up to it. In many cases, the payoff is too brief to justify the relative mediocrity of the lead-in. Examining the psychological motivation behind this phenomenon yields insights. We often conceive of supreme pleasure as something that occurs all at once at the very end, as if enjoyment could be compressed into a single instant. Overlooking that, the pleasure also emerges from the continuity and from the accumulation of smaller satisfactions. Should someone stay so focused on sparing the best for the finale, it's logical that their attention to the present fades. For instance, a person enthralled by not spoiling the center portion of a cake ends up missing the full savor of each preceding bite. With frequency, that concluding moment reveals itself to be only modestly more flavorful than the others, yet in the mind, it was elevated to a lofty promise. This is reminiscent of the phenomenon that high expectations often lead to disappointment. Additionally, there's no guarantee that what is presumed best is, objectively speaking, significantly different from the rest. Sometimes the entire cake has the same filling, but we've constructed a fiction that the middle is incomparable. As such, our enjoyment hinges on that fiction, and we run the risk that the final bite won't measure up to our inflated ideal. The paradox of the final bite thus illustrates that the extra pleasure one intended to obtain can vanish, while we also lose the overall delight that might have come from a balanced approach to the meal. An illustrative anecdote recounts how someone hosting a dinner party chose to spend most of their budget on a luxury dessert. The preceding courses were quite ordinary, basic salads, an uninspired main dish, under the assumption that a top-grade dessert would overshadow all else. Indeed, the dessert turned out delicious, but it wasn't so breathtaking as to erase a couple of hours of lackluster cuisine. The host realized that banking everything on that culminating showstopper didn't achieve the wow effect he expected, and that a better distribution of resources would have lifted the standard of the entire dinner. At the heart of this paradox is the imbalance created between a fondly imagined climax and the long duration leading up to it. The supposed advantage, having an extraordinary moment, gets tarnished If most of the earlier experience is half-hearted or overshadowed by yearning for the finale. Of course, it's not wrong to save something special. The problem emerges when such a strategy diverts focus from the entire journey, leaving the earlier segments as little more than a dull lead-up. If taken to the extreme, the person finds that their highest promise of pleasure has undermined the rest of the path. Hence, the final reflection entails questioning whether it's truly necessary to store up all the joy for one climactic instant. Maybe a less rigid approach is better, distributing some delight throughout instead of deferring it all for the final stroke. It can be more gratifying to savor that delicious morsel halfway through or even share it collectively, rather than turning it into an untouchable totem whose main force lies in anticipation, not in its actual taste. The paradox of the final bite essentially underscores how striving obsessively for one grand finale often delivers the opposite effect, diminishing enjoyment along the way and/or culminating in a moment that fails to match the dream. It may be far more worthwhile in life to maintain a balanced savor of each stage than to stake everything on a perfect ending that might never be quite as sublime as we imagined. Forced self-improvement paradox. In today's world, it's common to exalt the idea of constant self-improvement. We read countless self-help books, follow productivity gurus, adopt extreme workout routines, and cram our schedules with ever more demanding goals. All of this starts from the premise that to succeed, or be the best version of ourselves, we need unceasing effort. Yet this obsession with perpetual progress carries a paradox. The more we pressure ourselves to advance, the more we risk fatigue, discouragement, or even regressions. What initially seemed to be a path to greater performance can paradoxically become an obstacle that holds us back. The problem arises when the plan is taken to the extreme. Striving for improvement isn't inherently harmful. In fact, aiming for some degree of personal or professional growth is beneficial. But there's a blurry line beyond which the pursuit of progress becomes sheer overdemand. Consequently, a deep internal tension may emerge, bordering on chronic anxiety. One sets goals so high, with such tight deadlines and so little time to rest, that feelings of guilt creep in whenever that idealized standard isn't met. What began as a catalyst for growth morphs into a burden that undermines motivation. This is where we encounter the paradox of forced self-improvement. One might think that ramping up discipline and pressure will automatically lead to higher achievements, yet such saturation frequently yields the contrary effect. A handy example is someone who abruptly decides to overhaul all their habits at once. They adopt a strict diet with virtually no indulgences, add demanding daily exercise sessions, commit to reading one book per week, practice 45 minutes of meditation each morning, and meticulously schedule every hour to maximize productivity. At first, they feel euphoric, relishing the sense of controlling their time and crafting an impeccable self-improvement plan. But as days or weeks pass, physical exhaustion builds, the mind clamors for a break, and their social life suffers because they've left no space for meeting friends or unwinding. Suddenly, those goals start seeming unachievable. Intense exercise becomes increasingly grueling. The restrictive diet goes from inspiring to oppressive, and studying or reading turns from a pleasant pursuit into an arduous chore. Instead of nearing that idealized version of themselves, they find themselves overwhelmed and drained. Their sense of self-worth falters as they realize they can't handle it all. This scenario reveals the clash between the ambition to grow and the strain that such pressure exerts. The individual believed that simply raising the bar, more hours, more intensity, would automatically yield better results. Yet body and mind have an adaptation threshold that cannot be accelerated by mere force of will. If they had chosen a more gradual approach, they might have sustained the effort more consistently, solidifying changes in a stable way. However, the extreme approach led to burnout sooner. When that plan falls apart, frustration arises, fueling a deeper sense of failure and often prompting them to abandon everything rather than keep a moderate portion. That doesn't mean giving up on personal progress. It simply underscores how crucial it is to calibrate expectations and intensity. Genuine progress is typically incremental and sustainable, powered by motivation that isn't solely founded on iron discipline, but also on enjoyment and the acceptance that transformation won't happen overnight. Many habit formation experts advocate a gradual introduction of goals. If someone aims to start running, begin with brief distances rather than attempting 20 kilometers in 1 week if they've never run before. Likewise, in work or academic contexts, scheduling 15-hour workdays can backfire over time by triggering breakdowns that undermine any gains. The paradox of forced self-improvement stems from chasing fulfillment, physical, mental, or spiritual, through outright imposition, when that fulfillment actually requires a certain margin of enjoyment, rest, and assimilation. Sometimes, in striving to become our best version, we end up the most exhausted and dissatisfied version. This happens because, paradoxically, rushing the process neglects the person's natural pace of adaptation and ability to integrate each new habit. Indeed, cautionary tales abound. Individuals who devise extremely intense training regimens often wind up injured or demotivated after a few weeks, forfeiting much of the progress they might have made had they trained at a less punishing level over a longer period. We shouldn't interpret this paradox as praise for comfort or inactivity. Effort is valuable and frequently drives significant achievements. What's being questioned is the absence of moderation, the transformation of the drive for self-perfection into a doctrine that ignores realistic capacities. As a result, when a person realizes they can't do it all, their self-esteem suffers more than it would have if they had opted for a more balanced plan. Ultimately, this is about finding equilibrium between reasonable improvement and accepting some limits or rest. Moving forward doesn't mean barreling headlong. Both the body and mind need downtime, intervals to internalize each advance, celebrate small milestones, and avoid viewing every day as a fresh race to perfection. Paradoxically, those who adopt a step-by-step method, introducing changes gradually, respecting the need for leisure, usually reach more goals than those who bury themselves under tasks from the outset. The former group weaves new habits naturally into their lifestyle, whereas the latter creates a stressful environment that collapses sooner or later. The final takeaway of this paradox suggests that strength doesn't result from abrupt impositions, but from a method balancing discipline with realism, perseverance with respect for personal energy. When someone feels tempted to push to the max without pause, it's wise to remember that such a drive for extremes might eventually sabotage the very progress sought. Hence, the paradox of forced self-improvement teaches that healthy growth is that which is implemented prudently, flows without crushing motivation, and cements its changes solidly. In the end, balanced persistence yields more lasting benefits than a frantic sprint that leaves you breathless before you cross the finish line. Creative Perfectionism Paradox. In the world of art and creation, one frequently hears about projects that start off with boundless enthusiasm yet never see the light of day. Numerous artists, writers, or musicians admit that their drive to perfect every detail leads them into a dead end. They delete and rewrite, retouch brushstrokes, re-record and record again, always feeling that it's not ready yet. The paradox is that this pursuit of absolute perfection, ostensibly in search of the highest quality, ends up preventing the work from ever being completed. Those who suffer from this creative perfectionism can get stuck in an unending cycle of revisions, weighed down by frustration at having no finished piece to share with the world. The scenario of never publishing at all is the extreme outcome. The artist would rather keep their work to themselves than release it with any imperfections. It's helpful to imagine the case of an aspiring novelist. Full of excitement, they produce a first draft of their book. But upon rereading, they spot phrases that sound poorly constructed or passages they feel could be more forceful. Revision, a positive thing at the outset, kicks in. However, after a number of rewrites, they still believe the narrative isn't living up to what they envision. They decide to give it another pass, convinced that if I try hard enough, this story will be perfect. Months go by, or even years, as the person remains stuck in chronic perfectionism. Rather than moving toward editorial closure, they keep hauling each chapter back to the operating table. Eventually, the excitement they once felt wanes. Immersed for so long in their own text, they lose freshness. When asked about the manuscript, they can only smile halfway, saying, "I'm still revising it. It's not the way I'd like it yet." The contradiction comes into focus when we realize that although aiming for better quality propels textual improvement, a lack of practical limits can paralyze progress altogether. A product that never comes to fruition not only fails to reach an audience, but paradoxically may also degrade under the burden of repeated tinkering. The pursuit of excellence devolves into a dead end, since the rewriting never concludes. Hence the paradox. Setting out to achieve greatness in detail, the creator ends up smothering spontaneity and never actually finishes the piece. We see a parallel phenomenon in a painter who, with their canvas almost done, becomes fixated on a slight color shift in the lower corner. They adjust the tone, then notice something else upon stepping back, deciding it clashes too subtly with another section. Over and over, these micro-corrections prevent them from signing the painting off as complete. Every fix reveals another possible flaw, and the artist begins doubting their own sense of when to stop. Consequently, the canvas remains in a perpetual workshop, and the public never gets to see the final product, which might actually have been stronger at some earlier stage. Often, friends who come by the studio and look at the painting comment that it already looks wonderful, but the artist insists that something's still missing. That notion of "it's not there yet" can haunt them indefinitely. From the outside, potential readers, admirers, or even customers, if there's commercial interest, grow frustrated at perpetually waiting for a piece that is never formally displayed. How could a work be exhibited in a gallery, published, or uploaded to a music platform if the creator themselves calls it unfinished? In this way, creative perfectionism affects not just the artist, but also an audience eager to enjoy the output. A gap emerges between genuine external interest and the creator's inability to release the piece. It's essential to grasp that this paradox isn't advocating carelessness or a lack of ambition. Revising, refining, rewriting, and polishing remain integral parts of the creative process. The problem arises when there's no cap on that effort, pushing the revision stage so far that it extinguishes spontaneity and blocks the act of finalizing. One of the great hurdles is determining a good enough threshold, some minimal standard of quality at which the piece can be revealed without forfeiting its essential excellence. Many creators find that borderline elusive, often thanks to the fear of criticism or a sense that one's expectations haven't been met. Still, experience shows that an audience typically appreciates sincere work, even with minor flaws, far more than some hypothetical perfection that ends up in limbo. We can think of countless examples of famous artists who admitted not being fully satisfied with their finished pieces, but proceeded to publish them, understanding that an absolute perfection rarely exists. Their works made an impact despite, from their personal standpoint, not being perfect. In contrast, there are individuals whose creations remain hidden forever due to pathological perfectionism, causing them to vanish from the cultural radar. A manuscript abandoned in a drawer, a musical demo lost on a hard drive, or a painting perpetually in progress seldom leaves a mark on society or culture. Moreover, creative perfectionism can lead to what we might call outcome anxiety. The creator is so fixated on how the final product will be received that they forfeit the pleasure of creation. Instead of letting ideas flow freely, they anguish over each brushstroke, every musical note, or each written sentence, preemptively fearing negative reviews. Each small improvement fuels the mindset. If I revise it enough, no one will find flaws. In practice, there's always one more tweak possible, so the endless pursuit of polishing spawns a spiral of infinite revisions. The moral of this paradox is that to bring a creative work into the world, one needs the boldness to embrace it with a certain margin of imperfection. There's truth in the saying, works aren't completed, they're abandoned. A novel that's actually printed, even if not perfectly polished, will likely accomplish more than one held hostage in the author's endless drafts. A canvas displayed in public, albeit with minor details that might be improved, surpasses a hidden painting, unknown and condemned to silence. We're not glorifying negligence, but advocating a practical view that infinite perfection rarely leads anywhere but immobility. Hence the key lesson. A balance must be struck between striving for excellence and having the resolve to publish or exhibit the work. In practical terms, setting a deadline or limiting the number of revision passes can be extremely helpful. After a certain threshold, you accept the piece as concluded. So it's about establishing a good enough standard so you can share with the public or potential clients, opening the door to genuine feedback, commercial possibilities, or simple appreciation. After all, a well-crafted yet slightly imperfect piece offers more to the world than a theoretically flawless one that remains forever hidden. Creative perfectionism then warns us that unlimited pursuit of perfection can become paralyzing. Instead of condemning dedication, it cautions against the belief that only absolute flawlessness justifies sharing a work. Ultimately, creative freedom thrives on establishing some finishing criteria that enable progress from conception to audience, from personal illusion to actual manifestation. Without that conclusion, the creator and their creation risk getting lost in a perpetual cycle, missing the chance for their art to resonate with others. Sword and shield paradox. In ancient Chinese tradition, there's a story that talks about a merchant selling two items with apparently absolute qualities: a spear, or sword, powerful enough to pierce anything, and a shield so resistant that nothing could penetrate it. When a potential buyer asked what would happen if the spear struck the shield, the seller couldn't provide a coherent answer. From this, the paradox of the unstoppable spear versus the impenetrable shield emerged, sometimes referred to in different variants as the sword and shield paradox. The central question is, if the weapon truly pierces anything, then there can't be a flawless shield. Yet if there's a shield that truly resists everything, no spear should be able to go through it, thereby negating the premise of the unstoppable weapon. Consequently, we're faced with a collision between two logical absolutes that cannot coexist. At first glance, this paradox seems like a quaint anecdote, but it conceals real depth. One might say it's simply a merchant's story, yet it highlights the impossibility of reconciling two so-called total attributes. Claiming that something pierces everything implies that no barrier can withstand it, while labeling another object impenetrable means no weapon should breach it. If both existed and were tested against each other, one of these two principles would fail. Although the tale of the merchant is recounted in a somewhat colourful manner, in essence it points to the challenges that arise whenever we assign unwavering, opposite characteristics. In fact, this paradox extends beyond the example of a weapon. There are analogous forms in numerous areas, invincible forces facing unstoppable obstacles. One can consider legal systems that enact unbreakable laws facing someone with an infallible strategy to circumvent them, or technology debates about certain software claimed to be unhackable, while hackers say no system can be 100% secure. Whenever we assume two total properties traveling in opposite directions, logic indicates that it's impossible for both absolute definitions to coexist without contradiction. This undermines the notion of absolute infallibility or boundless power. What makes the story compelling is the conceptual debate it stirs. If we truly put an unstoppable sword up against an impenetrable shield, purely theoretically, either the sword is stopped, thus invalidating its unstoppable quality, or the shield is broken, thus negating its perfect defense. In other words, positing an object capable of absolute penetration alongside another with absolute resilience creates a contradiction. There is no logical way to resolve their encounter without one of the two definitions collapsing. This parallels other logical scenarios where unlimited properties clash. It's reminiscent of difficulties in logic or set theory, where talk of absolutes that reference each other leads to inconsistencies. It's often compared to the omnipotence problem. Can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that even they cannot lift it? Both examples illustrate the puzzle of claiming an all-powerful entity that faces something else, likewise presumed to be absolute. Philosophically speaking, the language of complete, unlimited attributes leads to contradiction once they're pitted against each other. Part of the intrigue in the old merchant's story rests on the fact that he boasted of each product's exaggerated traits without considering that someone might ask how they would fare if put head-to-head. Similarly, many times we see ultimate solutions pitched for complex problems, whether political or technological, ignoring that another force might exist which, likewise operating at an absolute level, will collide with that supposed perfection. Thus, the sword and shield paradox alerts us to the rhetorical overreach behind claims of total or universal solutions. It's worth pondering why society so readily tolerates these absolute claims. Possibly, from a marketing or ideological standpoint, proclaiming something unbeatable or unbreakable is alluring or at least impactful. But this paradox shows we should be skeptical of those descriptions. No commercial product can be completely secure and also face unlimited creativity and motivation from a wide range of consumers or adversaries. The history of cybersecurity repeatedly demonstrates how even the most reinforced systems can be compromised. The lesson of the sword and shield finds its parallel here. There is no truly final weapon nor a completely unbreachable shield in an environment where both technological and human cunning can continually evolve. Returning to the core reasoning of the paradox, it's crucial to highlight the significance of moderation in the attributes we define. Saying that a weapon is highly potent doesn't conflict with a shield being extremely strong. The problem arises when each quality is described as wholly total, an item that pierces everything versus one that resists anything. In absolute extremes, the conflict is inevitable, and language is forced into a logically inconsistent space. Consequently, this story urges us to approach claims of perfection or boundless capacity with caution. The all-or-nothing stance may seem appealing on paper, but it proves unsustainable under scrutiny. Ancient philosophers recognized in this paradox an illustration of how internal consistency is vital in argumentation. If you describe an object with total, unrestricted properties and simultaneously create another that cancels those properties out, you produce a gap in the reasoning that undermines the thesis. In practice, the solution would be to concede that either the sword isn't truly unstoppable or the shield isn't truly impenetrable, or else acknowledge that these two items could never exist together. Translated to modern context, it means that when someone talks about something being foolproof, it's worth asking, what if there really is a factor capable of conquering it? Thus, sword and shield become symbols of incompatible absolute powers clashing head-on. It recommends caution whenever we hear claims of a product or method that's absolutely unstoppable, particularly if it squares off against something else supposedly totally unbreachable. From marketing claims to scientific or theological debates, this simple narrative points out the futility of the logical contradictions born from pitting two opposite infinities against one another. Fascinatingly, although it stems from an ancient anecdote, it keeps its relevance by exemplifying the boundaries any ultimate promise faces when confronted by another fully absolute adversary. The paradox underscores that the real world rarely permits two entirely perfect entities of an opposite nature. One, or both, of them has to dial back that total status, or else the system cracks under contradiction. The Stockdale Paradox. Jim Stockdale, a United States Navy admiral, spent several years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. During that captivity, he saw how some companions who were excessively optimistic clung to beliefs like, "We'll be freed soon," or "We'll be out by the next holiday," only to have their spirits collapse whenever liberation didn't arrive as swiftly as they'd hoped. On the other hand, those who slid into complete pessimism ended up losing the will to resist. From this experience came the idea that the key lay in simultaneously sustaining two outlooks that at first glance seemed contradictory. A stark realism about the hardships here and now, coupled with an unwavering conviction that, in the long term, one would overcome adversity. Dubbed the Stockdale Paradox, it raises the question of how to maintain hope without naively denying the pain. It might initially appear a simple matter of balance, but the paradox arises because maintaining both views at once, this suffering is real and long-lasting, and we'll get through it eventually, can seem contradictory. We usually assume that if a person fully acknowledges the horror of the moment, their optimism for a better future should fade. Conversely, if they have ironclad faith that everything will turn out well, they might be inclined to downplay or ignore the severity of the problems. Stockdale argued that true resilience emerges when neither side is cast aside. Instead, recognizing the grimness of each day prevents catastrophic disappointment from unmet quick fixes, while preserving the belief that one will survive ensures the spark of perseverance. That dual stance, facing a cruel present while upholding a deep-seated trust in eventual success, underpinned Stockdale's psychological endurance. This concept applies in countless scenarios, including severe health issues where naive optimism, "You'll be fine next week," might cause people to overlook necessary care, only to be devastated when improvement doesn't meet their immediate hopes. Or the flip side, a destructive pessimism leading to utter capitulation. The Stockdale Paradox would have an individual confront the facts of the illness head-on, knowing it may be lengthy and grueling while still sustaining a belief, free of rigid deadlines, that better days are possible. One neither pretends it's easier than it is, nor concludes there's no point in trying. That twofold strategy, accepting present pain while projecting a more favorable future, has likewise become important for those coping with chronic or terminal diagnoses or searching to preserve some quality of life throughout the ordeal. A more everyday example might be someone facing imminent financial ruin. An overly naive optimism, "Tomorrow everything will magically be all right," ignores serious planning and fosters unwise choices. Total pessimism, however, could paralyze any attempt to recover. The Stockdale Paradox indicates acknowledging without illusions that the crisis is dire, requiring sacrifices, but simultaneously believing that, through great effort, a turnaround remains feasible. This person would draft realistic plans, refusing to slip into either a fantasy or a blind surrender. The paradox stems from what seems an impossible blend of two stances that standard logic would treat as incompatible. The paradox's core is that the coexistence of raw realism and unwavering faith appears illogical. We often figure that if one fully perceives how dire a situation is, hope must evaporate. If one insists on hope, that must mean papering over real pain. Stockdale illustrated that both elements can remain intact. Indeed, seeing reality in all its ugliness forestalls the crushing emotional crash when a supposed quick deliverance fails to happen, while holding on to a confident view of a brighter future, however distant or indefinite, energizes day-to-day survival. Hence, the tension between these seemingly irreconcilable stances turns out to be exactly what brings mental fortitude. The Stockdale Paradox has become a handy model for describing resilience. At no point does it claim we should concoct illusions about how easy the challenge is, but neither does it allow giving up. In a prison camp, Stockdale would counsel fellow inmates not to pin their hopes on guaranteed freedom by Christmas or by Easter, recognizing that missing these dates would cause a collapse in morale. Yet he urged them also not to assume they'd never be freed. This confluence, a refusal to sugarcoat the ordeal, paired with an inner certainty of eventual triumph, lays the foundation for not letting daily pain break one's resolve. The paradox label underscores that most people can't easily reconcile the unyielding acceptance of suffering with the conviction, "I will prevail." Yet precisely that balance delivered positive results in these extreme circumstances. Seen from another angle, this paradox highlights how an unfeigned assessment of a harsh reality doesn't necessarily cancel out a powerful optimism, so long as the optimism avoids the trap of assigning rigid timetables or trivializing the difficulties. Overly naive positivity crumbles against repeated setbacks, while pessimism kills off any chance at taking the steps needed to achieve improvement. The Stockdale Paradox proposes that integrating both dimensions, facing the grim present unflinchingly, trusting in an ultimate positive outcome, often yields the best chance of conquering adversity. In summary, the Stockdale Paradox explains that acknowledging the seriousness of one's plight doesn't annihilate the hope of eventually resolving it. In fact, naive optimism disintegrates on confronting reality, just as raw pessimism yields immediate defeat. Holding on to a far-reaching optimism devoid of inflexible deadlines or illusions, combined with a candid acceptance of how painful the situation might be, is the essence of this perspective. It's not that adversity becomes less harsh, rather, acceptance clarifies one's position without erasing the underlying aspiration for something better. Stockdale's great contribution during captivity was showing fellow prisoners that they must not delude themselves with baseless schedules for release, while likewise avoiding succumbing to hopelessness. That twofold vantage point, grim daily recognition and an enduring someday faith, allowed them to manage torture, isolation and humiliation without losing their broader objective. Ultimately, the paradox reveals the clash between the immediacy of circumstances and the viewpoint of a future, where one might be tempted to choose only one extreme, disavowing the challenge or rejecting any hope. The confluence of realism and confidence is what truly proves effective. The Stockdale Paradox is thus frequently cited to illuminate resilience. Simply put, admitting the harshness of your predicament needn't destroy your belief in emerging from it. In day-to-day life, people can apply it in the face of personal crises, illnesses, or major conflicts by practicing that double vision, which seems paradoxical, yet stands out as the most robust manner to endure and ultimately move forward. The card paradox. In a mental experiment, we take a simple cardboard card with two statements on its two faces that, at first glance, seem trivial. Yet when read together, they trigger a logical loop with peculiar consequences. Typically, it's presented like this. On side A, we read, "The statement on side B is false," while side B says, "The statement on side A is true." At first, this might come across as no more than a playful trick, But as soon as we attempt to judge their truth values, we get caught up in a paradox akin to the liar paradox. This sentence is false, albeit with a less abstract approach thanks to the tangible format of a card. The problem arises from distributed self-reference. Each side of the card makes a claim about the truthfulness of the other. Imagine we try to declare that side A is true, which would then mean the statement on side B is false. However, side B explicitly says that side A is true. We end up with a contradiction. If B is false, it can't correctly state that A is true. Thus, the assumption that A is true leads to a dead end. By the same token, if we start off by assuming that A is false, we run into a similar loop. The result? No assignment of truth or falsehood to both statements simultaneously can avoid inconsistency. Essentially, the card offers a two-sided variant of the liar paradox, where the load is spread across two different statements that in turn refer to one another. The physical simplicity of the card, an A side and a B side, makes the paradox more visible than the classic formulation of the liar paradox. This sentence is false. In the liar paradox, the contradiction is contained in just one proposition, whereas in the card scenario, each side references the other, forming a crisscross of self-reference. The underlying issue is the same. Language becomes incapable of maintaining consistency when an utterance itself, or a paired utterance, must evaluate its own veracity. At the core of these sorts of conflicts lies the impossibility of consistently upholding a statement as true if it implies the other is false, which in turn supports or negates the first. The human mind seeks a logical coherence that these mirror-like self-references can't provide. In philosophical or logical realms, and even in set theory, this relates to problems arising from uncontrolled recursion. Indeed, in the history of mathematics, Bertrand Russell discovered similar contradictions when a set defined its own membership, or lack thereof. The idea of all sets that are not members of themselves created a puzzle paralleling this loop. Such paradoxes drove the development of restricted axioms in logic and set theory to prevent a system from sliding into inconsistency. One lesson of the card paradox is the need to narrow self-reference so as not to fall into rhetorical traps. Natural language abounds with rhetorical structures that might yield similar effects, though less transparently than the physical example of the card. In more formal contexts, be it artificial intelligence or computing, it becomes crucial to define systems carefully so they don't trip over rules that either define or invalidate each other with no possible resolution. Likewise, the paradox highlights inherent limitations of classical logic, which aims to label statements as either true or false without contemplating a third option or the suspension of judgment. Certain alternative logical frameworks, fuzzy logic, paraconsistent logic, and so on, propose different methods, but in the usual binary true-false environment, the card leads to an impasse. This reveals how our intuition that every statement must be true or false falters in the face of cyclical self-reference. Beyond its intellectual curiosity, the card paradox mirrors everyday discussions where two parties speak about each other in a mutually exclusive fashion, or their definitions loop so thoroughly that it's impossible to decide who's right. We often encounter dialogues in which person A claims person B is lying, whereas person B asserts that person A is truthful, or vice versa, generating a logical mess if we try to fix an absolute criterion of truth. This underscores that, where language addresses itself in a reciprocal way, we're at risk of irreconcilable contradictions. Another interesting dimension is the paradox's material aspect. The sight of an actual card, one statement on each side, underscores how the contradiction appears to live on the object. In truth, though, it's a semantic and logical conflict residing in the sentences, not in the piece of cardboard. We could rewrite these statements on sticky notes or on a pair of posters, and the paradox would persist. The physical format merely helps visualize how side A's claim about side B and side B's claim about side A collide. In practice, someone might ask, how can we solve it? With informal logic, the standard reply is that we can't, not unless we limit the ability of both claims to judge each other or adopt non-classical logical systems that permit the possibility of controlled contradictions. But in most everyday contexts, the outcome is that there is no coherent resolution. The urge to assign a truth value to an utterance that refutes or endorses the veracity of its partner, which in turn does the same, devolves into an infinite loop. Thus, the card paradox concerns our notion of truth and falsehood. It reminds us that if we don't restrict self-reference, we entangle ourselves in perplexities. Even in ordinary disputes, it can be helpful to rely on an external arbiter of sorts rather than letting each statement self-validate or self-nullify to the point of circular chaos. Consequently, the conclusion is that language, so essential to express ideas and explore reality, can obstruct itself if it entangles in reciprocal definitions without a way out. The two sides of the card, each containing a statement that disputes or confirms the other in a circular dynamic, reveals the brittleness of the principle of bivalence, true, false, when it comes up against recursion. Simultaneously, it underscores human curiosity in pressing against these limits to see what logic can or cannot encompass. The enrichment paradox, one of the most common aims in modern society, is to boost wealth, accumulate properties, fatten bank accounts, and thus, presumably, ensure a pleasant and secure life. However, it often happens that those who devote themselves most fervently to increasing their assets end up drastically reducing their ability to enjoy what they earn. The enrichment that was supposed to grant independence can, paradoxically, turn into a subjugation to endless work and constant worry. The issue does not lie in prosperity itself, but rather in making the accumulation of resources an all-consuming purpose that overshadows every other facet of life. Someone who falls into this dynamic typically begins with positive intentions. They want enough money to comfortably support their family, maybe fulfill some dreams and protect themselves against potential mishaps. But as their income grows, they feel compelled to climb even higher. They work longer days, neglect rest, postpone social gatherings, and steadily shrink any space for personal downtime. What started as a plan to attain stability becomes a cycle where nothing is ever enough. Each achievement reveals a new, more ambitious goal. Thus, personal life, health, and the simple ability to be present in daily affairs dwindle. The paradox emerges on recognizing that the supposed freedom conferred by possessing ample funds fails to manifest, since the individual's daily routine has morphed into a ceaseless race for greater gains. A desire for financial growth is not intrinsically a bad thing. Having money can help manage emergencies, open cultural doors, and offer better educational opportunities. The critical point arrives when that pursuit becomes obsessive, to the extent of eclipsing the joy it was meant to bring. Beneath such obsession often lurks an insatiable fear of lack or an unremitting competition, whether with others or oneself. The legitimate desire to improve one's situation devolves into anxiety about the next milestone. Consequently, one lives in perpetual, in the meantime, waiting for some moment of calm that never arrives, for as resources increase, so do the demands and pressures attached. Hence, the enrichment paradox fundamentally concerns how the supposed path to total autonomy may become servitude to constant expansion of one's wealth. In response, many personal finance and wellness experts advocate defining a clear objective, discerning how much income or which lifestyle truly meets one's core needs and affords some breathing room. Beyond that threshold, each extra dollar may have diminishing returns on happiness, while stress intensifies. The question is, at what point does earning more genuinely enhance my well-being, and at what juncture does the frantic pursuit of more begin to produce the opposite. The moral lesson is that it's not about whether one has or lacks money, but rather about why one wants it and how one uses it. Succumbing to the obsession of indefinite accumulation is the trap that empties one's daily life. Ultimately, many discover that real fulfillment springs from having enough tranquil hours to share with loved ones, to cultivate hobbies, or to safeguard personal well-being. If money fails to facilitate that, if it blocks it instead, the entire project becomes paradoxical. Enrichment should be a means that elevates quality of life, not a goal that destroys it. With this perspective, it's possible to aim for prosperity, yet remain conscious that satisfaction is not measured solely by numbers. From a broader outlook, this balance averts the paradox. Instead of sacrificing everything for greater earnings, it helps to establish a limit that allows enjoyment of what's been gained without being consumed by the vortex of endless accumulation. Service recovery. In customer or user relations, there's a striking observation. On occasion, a service that makes a mistake but excels in correcting it leads to greater satisfaction than a service that never made a mistake in the first place. This might appear counterintuitive, since one might presume that a flawless, error-free experience is the best scenario. However, the so-called service recovery paradox indicates that, faced with a problem that's skillfully resolved, the customer ends up more appreciative than if nothing had ever gone wrong. The underlying cause of this phenomenon lies in the emotional transformation the user undergoes, moving from initial frustration, caused by the error, to gratitude if the company's response proves both swift and empathetic. The mechanism of this paradox revolves around the shift in emotions. First, there's disappointment or anger due to the flaw, like a mistaken hotel booking, a damaged product, or a delivery that arrives late. But if the provider reacts swiftly and effectively, apologizing genuinely and offering some form of compensation, a discount, an unexpected upgrade, or a small extra, the user transitions from negative emotions to unexpectedly positive ones. Surprised that the company, rather than ignoring or minimizing the incident, has given it special priority, the user's loyalty and appreciation often surge. Eventually, in their recollection, that brand or service is seen as one that, when an error did occur, responded with excellence and consideration, sometimes creating a deeper impact than a scenario with no initial issues, but also without any singularly outstanding gesture. Of course, this doesn't mean that businesses should induce problems on purpose, because if the mistakes are too severe or repetitive, no remedy will suffice to preserve trust. The key is that the failings be infrequent or minor, paired with a prompt, generous response that convinces the customer or user they are genuinely cared for. Many studies in marketing and consumer psychology have labeled this phenomenon the service recovery paradox. The prime reason is that the person sees the empathy and commitment of the service provider, feeling that a genuine effort was made to fix the situation. That journey from negative expectation to a resolution that surpasses the original standard creates a memorable effect. It isn't merely about business. The principle resonates in personal or family contexts too. A disagreement with a friend can, if handled with sincere apologies and some act of amends, fortify a bond more than if everything had gone smoothly. The paradox stands in how, rather than being spoiled by the trouble, the bond grows deeper because the resolution is honest and actively caring. Yet not every mistake triggers this effect. If the error is extreme or recurs often, confidence erodes. The paradox generally arises when the mishap is manageable and offset by a swift, generous resolution that outweighs the initial annoyance. That gratifying surprise emerges. The user or friend goes from negative anticipation to a resolution that surpasses expectations, embedding a strong emotional impression. All told, the lesson of service recovery is that perfect consistency isn't always what produces the strongest emotional connection. There's something about falling down and getting back up, well managed, that forms an enduring imprint. Often a customer who never faced any inconvenience ends up quietly satisfied, but lacking a singularly resonant memory. One who encountered a glitch and then saw an outstanding correction may become a passionate advocate of the brand or person. Similarly, in daily life, a dispute resolved correctly can leave a sense of renewed closeness. Hence, the paradox demonstrates that a well-handled mishap can prove more memorable and valued than a seamless if unremarkable experience, illustrating how empathy and attentiveness in correcting errors hold a special power to transform negative feelings into loyalty. The lottery paradox. In most countries, the lottery has become deeply woven into popular culture. Millions of people buy a ticket each week, hoping for their lives to be transformed by an extraordinary prize. Yet from a statistical perspective, the odds of winning are infinitesimal, sometimes around 1 in tens of millions. Even so, lottery sales remain hugely successful. The paradox arises when we observe that so many bettors, whether consciously or not, harbor an optimism at odds with the evidence. An overwhelming percentage will lose, but they continue believing that someone has to win, and therefore it could be me. The lottery's appeal hinges largely on the promise of instant success. The imagination-fueling notion of overnight life change is captivating, and socially it's often encouraged to think that one can get wealthy in a single stroke of luck without great effort. This illusion draws many in. Given even the slightest possibility, remote though it is, of a lucky break, people feel prompted to participate, despite what math indicates that almost everyone will be disappointed. They argue that if some individuals do benefit over the entire history of a lottery, it's worthwhile continuing to try, even though the ratio of winners to losers is minuscule. Thus, the practice of purchasing tickets endures, powered by the wish to escape everyday financial routines. The gap between subjective optimism and objective statistics forms the core of this paradox. On one hand, the chance of hitting the big prize is effectively minuscule. In many lotteries, the chance that your combination of numbers will come up is on the order of 1 in several million, meaning that, practically speaking, your hope for a genuine win is almost nil. On the other hand, myriad participants ignore or tune out that numeric reality. A dissonance emerges. Almost everyone loses, but someone wins, and people cling to the idea that one day it might be them. This phenomenon is not only driven by naivete, it also rests on the potent emotional component of fantasizing about riches, as well as on our inclination to think that great things happen to those who take a chance. Some individuals, moreover, incorporate rituals or superstitions to court luck. An example is sticking to the same number for years, certain it must be due to come up. This reasoning, shaped by the gambler's fallacy, overlooks the fact that a lottery, by and large, has no memory. A number's not having appeared yet does not heighten its probability of appearing in the future. Nevertheless, many persist in the same strategy, growing ever more confident in a supposed imminent success as they accumulate more losses. This also occurs when people believe they must purchase tickets at a particular store with a winning streak, or only do so on specific days or times, claiming fortune is concentrated there. This magical thinking couples with social pressure. News stories about happy winners who achieved fabulous wealth overnight are widely publicized, while countless participants who lose week after week get no media spotlight. Thus, the collective imagination retains the notion that, yes, one of us will get it eventually. Lottery advertising further plays up minimal costs alongside colossal potential rewards. For many, it's harmless entertainment, akin to paying for the daydream between buying the ticket and the draw, even if that daydream rests on a minuscule chance of winning. The paradox lies in the mismatch between statistical impossibility, virtually all participants end up empty-handed, and the enduring commitment of huge numbers of people who cling to hope. From a sociological angle, the lottery is upheld by the promise that anyone, regardless of class or educational background, might abruptly become a millionaire. That universality appeals to a broad public, fueling the illusion. There's also the argument that in some places lottery proceeds fund social programs. Part of the revenue goes to public works, scholarships, or various initiatives, but overall, most players do not recover what they've spent. Does this suggest that people ought to stop playing entirely? For many, the lottery is merely entertainment. If one buys a ticket without treating it as an actual investment, but rather as a small indulgence that fosters a moment of fantasy, there is no major concern. The real danger arises when someone pins their financial well-being on the lottery, devoting a significant chunk of their budget to gambling, harming family finances by claiming it might happen at any moment. That's where the line between harmless fantasy and self-deception becomes blurred. As an anecdote, there are people who, after winning a modest prize, get convinced luck is on their side and intensify ticket buying, piling into more drawings or various parallel lotteries. In most cases, they do not replicate the initial stroke of fortune and only accrue further losses. Or the opposite scenario, someone who has never won anything but persists with the same number or the same ritual, thinking one day it has to happen, trapped in the belief that probabilities increase through perseverance. Neither approach actually surmounts the statistical abyss that relegates nearly all buyers to the non-winning majority. Overall, the lesson is the importance of confronting lottery games and similar forms of gambling with realism. There's no harm in indulging in a bit of fantasy as long as it's seen as a discretionary cost, a means of entertainment, not a serious investment. The complication arises if it morphs into a financial strategy, the plan for escaping debt, or the lifeline to overcome a crisis, an approach that can become perilous. The lottery paradox finds life in precisely that discrepancy between people's enormous hopes and the cold math. Many cling to "someone must win," forgetting that the chance of being that someone is tiny. Therefore, the final reflection suggests that if someone decides to play, they do so with moderation, recognizing that lottery functions more as a pastime than a credible route to wealth. Certainly, it's possible one lucky soul will pick the winning numbers and see their life change, but banking on that minuscule possibility while ignoring the probability is where the discrepancy takes root. Embracing the daydream isn't the problem. Letting that dream overshadow actual economic planning is. Consequently, the paradox is resolved by viewing the lottery as mere amusement, not as a guaranteed economic rescue, thus easing the contradiction between grand expectations and the stark reality that almost everyone loses. The Ship of Theseus Paradox. In Greek mythology and philosophy, there is a well-known story about Theseus, the Athenian hero, famed for feats such as defeating the Minotaur in Crete. Legend has it that to honor him, the citizens of Athens kept his ship in a dock over the years. Each time one of its wooden planks deteriorated or rotted, they replaced it with a new one, ostensibly preserving the vessel's form and function. As time passed, nearly all of the original parts were eventually swapped out. The question that then arose was, is this still the same ship that once sailed on Theseus's legendary adventures, or is it no longer that ship at all? This conundrum, known as the paradox of the Ship of Theseus, has prompted numerous viewpoints and discussions, not just in antiquity but also up to the present day, concerning identity and continuity. The core dilemma lies in what exactly defines an object's essence or identity. In the case of the ship, if identity depends solely on physical matter, we must concede that after so many years and so many plank replacements, nothing of the original material remains, hence it can't be the same vessel. However, if we believe that identity rests on form, structure, or the history that envelops it, we might argue that as long as the same design, name, and purpose persist, we can indeed call it the ship of Theseus. Put differently, one side champions the notion that the object's identity lives on in its unbroken historical succession, while another side asserts that replacing the material ultimately destroys that original uniqueness. This philosophical debate has broadened beyond the ancient story itself. An instructive parallel concerns the human body. Every so often, our bodily cells regenerate, which means they're not the same ones we had in the past. If identity hinged entirely on stable physical composition, we would have to say that we've stopped being the same person, because a substantial portion of our cells differ from those of years ago. Yet most people assume that despite such cellular turnover, the person remains fundamentally the same, perhaps because some psychological continuity, memory, or biographical cohesion surpasses mere material changes. In that sense, the Ship of Theseus paradox echoes the question of whether we're the same over decades and how that sameness might be determined. Modernity offers abundant analogous cases. Picture a car whose components are replaced bit by bit. One year it gets a new engine, the next year a new chassis, later a new transmission, and so forth, until no original part remains. Should we still call it the same car we initially purchased, or consider a piece of complex software that, with each new version, rewrites parts of its code, modifies or replaces features, and over many years evolves so drastically that scarcely any trace of the original program endures? Does it preserve its identity from the first iteration, or does that vanish at some point? In the ship's case, some claim that continuity over time is what keeps it the same. Thus, the Ship of Theseus, or any comparable object, retains identity provided it maintains the same purpose, name, and public perception. So the definition of what it is relies on a sustained transformation rather than unchanging material. Others, however, stress that the complete exchange of physical components annihilates the original identity, no matter how closely the shape or the name is preserved. This debate also connects with the conceptual essence of a thing. One viewpoint proposes a formal criterion. As long as spatial arrangement, intended use, and historical continuity remain unbroken, the ship is the same. Even if all the wood changes, there's a narrative through line, a story of its use that preserves identity. Another viewpoint insists that once none of the original material remains, the object no longer is what it was. One can intensify this paradox by imagining all those replaced planks being stored and used eventually to reconstruct a second ship. Which one is truly authentic? Is it the one bearing the name, shape, and ongoing usage record, or the one built from the original matter? This spin-off question further highlights the clash between historical continuity and the physical substance. Likewise, the paradox of the Ship of Theseus reveals how flexible the concept of being the same thing can be. Practically speaking, institutions, museums, or collections might exhibit an original object that has been restored repeatedly over centuries. At what point do we stop calling it the genuine piece, given that so much of the material has been replaced? In art history, comparable debates emerge with frescoes or paintings that, after multiple restorations, have lost much of the original brushwork. Do we still consider them the artist's creation, or now a reconstruction by conservators? The paradox thus shows that identity isn't necessarily a plain or binary concept. Some philosophers resolve this paradox by emphasizing uninterrupted existence as the basis of identity. The Ship of Theseus remains the same insofar as Athens maintained and designated it as such without pausing its use. Its being the same ship comes from the shared tradition and function. It's Theseus's vessel because we've looked after it and still consider it so. Analogously, human beings recognize themselves across time through memory, consciousness, or a psychological sense of self, rather than stable cells, Nevertheless, for those who regard matter as fundamental to identity, each replacement of parts undermines and finally dissolves that original essence. In practice, these discussions underscore that objects don't hold a single, unchanging source of identity. A more pragmatic view might say that continuity of use, naming and form shapes the unity, or a physicalist approach might insist that once the original matter is gone, the object is as well. However one decides, the enduring appeal of the ship of Theseus arises from forcing us to ask what makes something what it is. This, in a deeper sense, extends to our own selves, our possessions, or any system that updates its components gradually. Ultimately, the conclusion is that identity can rest upon several dimensions: formal continuity, tradition, naming, functional roles, or the material itself. Such a conclusion suggests that being the same thing isn't an immutable idea, but rather a construction molded by perspective. Those who favor a historical stance will hold that, even if all the parts are replaced, the essence remains via continuity. Those who favor a material stance insist that fully replacing components loses the original identity. In the end, the ship of Theseus paradox reveals a constant tension between change and permanence, between flow and the identity we impose. It aligns with the philosophical insight that nothing, ourselves included, remains entirely static, yet we keep a notion of still being the same, at least in a certain narrative or functional sense. Hence it becomes a timeless puzzle, prodding us to rethink what truly defines an entity throughout its ongoing transformation. The surprise exam paradox. In a typical classroom, a teacher announces to their students that sometime in the coming school week, say between Monday and Friday, there will be a surprise test. The students, determined to outsmart this unexpected quiz, decide to analyze logically on which day it might occur. Their reasoning begins with the idea that if Thursday night arrives without the exam having taken place, then it would necessarily have to happen on Friday, at which point, however, it would stop being a surprise, as they would already know. Therefore, they conclude that Friday cannot be a valid day for a genuinely unanticipated test. Put differently, the argument holds that if one reaches Thursday evening with no quiz yet administered, Friday is the only remaining day and thus no longer unexpected. Once they have eliminated Friday using that line of thought, they apply the same logic to Thursday. If Friday is off the table, then Thursday becomes the last possible option. But if Wednesday night passes without the exam, they'd be certain it must be on Thursday, once again cancelling the element of surprise. And so on, they apply this backtrack approach to Wednesday, then Tuesday, and finally Monday, ultimately concluding, paradoxically, that there is no day on which the test can logically be given without losing its surprise quality. In reality, however, something very different often happens. The teacher administers the test on a Wednesday, or a Tuesday, or even a Monday, while there are still a few days left in the week, and the students end up genuinely caught off guard. This outright disproves the chain of reasoning that seemingly proved the impossibility of the exam. The conflict here is that the logic, although it seems flawless at first, operates under the assumption that if the exam doesn't happen until the last day, that day would cease to be surprising. Then they move backward through each day using the same rationale. But in practice, the exam can appear earlier, well before students can be certain, thereby fulfilling the requirement of surprise. This scenario underscores the tension between linear logic and the nature of unexpected events. The students aim to rule out each day by starting with Friday and working in reverse, concluding that none remain feasible. Yet their backward chain depends on the exam not happening on any of the days in question, a premise that's undone the moment the test occurs on, for example, Wednesday. The test blindsides them because they had already ruled out that day in their reasoning, The paradox highlights how seemingly impeccable deduction can crash into the everyday reality of partial knowledge and how actual happenings can defy that deduction. The teacher relies on the students not being able to pinpoint with certainty when the test will occur, preserving its surprise element. Meanwhile, the student's "no day is possible" argument fails the instant the exam is given on a day they dismissed. This friction reveals the intricacies that arise when an event depends on the participant's incomplete awareness, combined with the notion of a real surprise. Some refer to a parallel scenario called the unexpected hanging paradox, where a prisoner is informed that execution will happen on an unanticipated day of a certain week, and he tries to logically eliminate each day, yet in the end, the event still takes place unexpectedly. The logic of discarding each possible date seems valid at first glance, only to be undermined by the actual occurrence. The fundamental moral of this paradox is that not all situations can be exhaustively deduced if they hinge on lack of certainty among those involved. The surprise exam is precisely an event meant to remain unknown until it happens. Even if one tries to systematically dismiss all days, the teacher can simply choose one of the earlier ones, ensuring genuine surprise. In a sense, the students assume they'll attain an absolute certainty by eliminating each day, but that conviction unravels the moment the test is held earlier and thus remains unexpected. From a broader standpoint, the surprise exam paradox provides a case study in how linear logic squares off against the unpredictability of real events, especially when self-awareness and partial information are in play. The student's chain of exclusion is grounded in a scenario that demands having reached the final day of the week for them to be certain, but the exam's early occurrence prevents the chain from concluding successfully. Another notable dimension is the role of collective self-consciousness. Students attempt to reason day by day, factoring in whether or not the quiz has already happened. However, one timely intervention by the teacher, giving the exam on a day well before the last, shatters their entire assumption of "it can't be that day." Ultimately, this paradox demonstrates the difficulty in predicting something designed to be unpredictable using a step-by-step elimination. The attempt to prove that it can't be Monday, can't be Tuesday, can't be Wednesday, etc. collapses once the test, or surprise, takes place without waiting until all possibilities are supposedly ruled out. That contradiction speaks volumes about the limits of deduction in the face of contingency and partial knowledge. It's not a mere puzzle or trick. The logic-laden argument smashes into reality, which can fulfill the surprise in ways the argument can't accommodate. At heart, the paradox underlines that a surprise requires some measure of ignorance or inability to exclude a day with finality. That's why the logic of discarding each day ends up failing, because the real situation is that the teacher can act at a juncture when the students aren't truly certain. Therefore, the crux of the paradox is how anticipating the unanticipated works against purely linear reasoning, calling attention to the difference between a theoretical sequence of eliminations and the empirical nature of an event that occurs before those eliminations can be completed. This example thus showcases a fascinating trait of the human condition. Despite our fixation on controlling or rationalizing everything, authentic surprises can still materialize, foiling even the most determined chain of assumptions. Overabundance Paradox. In everyday life, the paradox of overabundance refers to the curious situation in which the more options a person is offered, the harder it usually is for them to make a decision that satisfies them, and the greater the distress they experience throughout that process. At first glance, one would assume that having a broad range of possibilities guarantees a choice more closely tailored to individual preferences. However, it often transpires that rather than making things easier, it ends up complicating the decision and increasing dissatisfaction. That excess of information and potential paths causes a mental overload. What seemed like greater freedom becomes a psychological burden. A very typical example appears when dining at a restaurant whose menu is enormously extensive. In theory, the variety should allow us to find the perfect dish, but often the customer spends quite some time reading every name and description, worrying that whichever one they pick might be overshadowed by something even better. Even after ordering, they remain somewhat uncertain. Could I have chosen more wisely? Maybe there was a better dish. This unease links to potential regret. With so many options, it's easy to suspect that another one might have been more suitable. Thus, what should be a pleasure, the diversity on offer, becomes overshadowed by confusion and insecurity. The same paradox emerges in streaming platforms where thousands of series and movies are available. The user can wind up devoting more time to scrolling through the catalogue and reading synopses than they do actually watching something. Moreover, when they finally pick a show, they still feel torn, aware that countless other possibilities remain untouched. Before you know it, the evening might be spent mostly browsing without finding anything definitive. Or you pick something almost at random, only to worry later that a better choice was left behind. This dynamic also surfaces when buying a gift. The internet offers multiple stores with endless listings, and people can get lost assessing differences, prices, and reviews until decision fatigue sets in. We see this same pattern when planning vacations in a world filled with tempting destinations. Having an endless range of choices, hundreds of hotels, multiple attractions, rather than guaranteeing the dreamiest possible trip, generates anxiety for many travelers. They might spend hours or days doing comparisons, only to remain uncertain or suspect that an even more spectacular tour or cheaper and more charming lodging slipped through their fingers. In addition, once they do choose, some keep combing through review websites, continually dreading that they might have gone for a slightly inferior option. The surfeit of alternatives thus becomes a source of stress. From the field of psychology, this phenomenon is known as choice overload. The human brain copes relatively comfortably with a moderate set of options, but it struggles when that variety explodes. On the one hand, carefully weighing numerous features or prices becomes very arduous. On the other, final dissatisfaction can be greater. Consumers or users suspect that, because there were so many choices, their chance of having chosen badly is high, and thus they think, what if there was something better? The nominal freedom that a vast catalogue promised ends up fostering insecurity and fatigue. Research on consumer behavior shows that, in general, people feel more satisfied when deciding among a few well-defined alternatives rather than in a sea of near-equivalent ones. The paradox of overabundance doesn't suggest rejecting diversity in itself. Rather, it highlights the danger of unbounded excess of options. Some businesses have discovered that presenting too many products, for instance, dozens of different jams at a tasting, lowers sales instead of boosting them because the buyer feels overwhelmed and decides not to purchase at all. So, contrary to expectations, offering fewer but well-organized items can improve user experience as it fosters a clearer decision. A carefully selected or curated assortment sometimes produces more effective results than an uncontrolled proliferation of alternatives. What happens is that, to choose with composure, one often requires some prior guiding principle or objective. Without any notion of which features matter most, the person feels compelled to painstakingly examine every possibility, entering a laborious process prone to collapse. If, on the other hand, you define from the start what is essential, say for a cell phone, battery life, then the amount of stress shrinks significantly because many models can be filtered out easily. Nevertheless, when one lacks any such priority and is faced with hundreds of near-identical offerings, the experience quickly becomes exhausting, and it's common to finish with the sense of having wasted too much time without necessarily achieving higher satisfaction. Ultimately, the paradox of overabundance draws attention to the gap between the notion the more variety the better, and the reality that an excessive multitude of alternatives erodes the user's confidence while generating weariness. Those forced to discriminate among a huge number of almost indistinguishable options end up paralyzed or uneasy at the thought of making the wrong choice. Regret lies in wait behind each possibility, since, with a big or almost infinite menu or catalogue, it's simple to imagine that there was a better pick. That phenomenon undermines both enjoyment and trust in one's selection. Thus, the paradox points out that in many contexts, a carefully curated offering might be more advantageous than an imposing inventory. A consumer looking for a specific wine, for instance, might appreciate a concise menu of well-explained selections instead of a never-ending list of labels where nothing stands out. This doesn't mean advocating scarcity as an absolute ideal, but rather underlining the importance of balanced management of offerings. Sometimes simplicity makes life easier and leads to a safe, relaxed choice. In short, the paradox of overabundance arises from the mismatch between a bigger range must logically be better and the lived experience that too many possibilities can create confusion and dissatisfaction. The human brain doesn't handle an uncontrolled deluge of options well, nor can it evaluate them all without stress. In streaming services, overloaded menus, massive online shopping catalogues, or trips with countless destinations, it's fairly common for the consumer or traveler to feel overwhelmed, sometimes failing even to enjoy the process. Understanding this paradox encourages reflection on the fact that quality does not always stem from quantity, and that paring down, filtering, or guiding our choices may be the path to genuine contentment. The knowledge paradox. In the history of thought, we frequently see the observation that the more someone delves into a field of knowledge, the more they realize just how much they still don't know. The knowledge paradox specifically addresses this phenomenon. Instead of arriving at a feeling of total mastery when accumulating large amounts of data and theories, a true scholar senses the vastness of what remains unexplored. A contrast emerges between the novice, who occasionally believes they're on the brink of understanding it all, and the expert, who is overwhelmed by the many unanswered questions and the infinite branches of their discipline. The result is that the genuine sage, rather than declaring, "I know everything," says, "I still have so much to discover." The starting point of this effect lies in the illusion of initial simplicity. When a person enters a field for the first time, they only see a handful of basic concepts. With some effort, they learn them and gain confidence by realizing they grasp those fundamentals. Then comes the temptation to think they've already got the core figured out, without recognizing that what they've seen is just the tip of the iceberg. The paradox arises because that confidence can be greater at the beginner stage, since they have not reached a depth that unveils the field's true scope. Put differently, the newcomer does not perceive all the underlying complexities, and thus they feel surer than they objectively should. The well-known Dunning-Kruger effect in psychology addresses something similar. Less competent or less experienced individuals in a particular domain tend to overestimate their skills, whereas more competent or experienced ones underestimate themselves by seeing the breadth of what they don't know. So, the inexperienced person, who can't see how extensive their ignorance is, feels more confident, while the expert, who has traveled much further down the road, grasps how many frontiers remain unknown. Consequently, the advanced learner becomes more humble in the face of the discipline's limitless intricacy. The paradox becomes clear when, for instance, we watch a college student progress. In the early semesters, they might think the introductory courses have shown them the main essentials, but as they proceed to more advanced subjects, they realize those initial lessons only sketched a small outline, and each theme radiates into entire specializations. By the time they reach the end of their degree, and especially if they approach research, the notion of having answered some questions is accompanied by the awareness that the discipline is overflowing with open issues. Often this feeling is magnified during graduate studies. As soon as the person doesn't stop stumbling upon new lines of work, competing theories, and unresolved challenges, they become even more convinced, ironically, that they barely know anything, despite being an expert with deep, specific knowledge. It's commonly said that ignorance is bold. When someone knows little, they fail to notice the host of details they haven't mastered and proceed with unwavering conviction that they've nearly understood it all. This phenomenon is often visible in certain debates, where individuals with a shallow grasp of a subject assert themselves with absolute certainty, oblivious to how patchy their foundation is. By contrast, one who truly digs deeper handles so many aspects of the topic that, before making categorical statements, they demonstrate caution and admit their limitations. Sometimes such caution is misconstrued as insecurity, but in reality, it reflects maturity in recognizing that truth can be inexhaustibly complex. In many scientific disciplines, the so-called frontier of knowledge keeps expanding. Each new finding solves a question, but often yields 10 fresh ones. As more refined instruments or more data processing come into play, we confirm that reality outstrips the models we currently hold. This endless nature of inquiry is what keeps the knowledge paradox thriving. Nobody, no matter how specialized, can truly encompass an entire field. In medicine, for example, someone focusing on a single organ or a single diagnostic technique realizes there are thousands of conditions or medical advances they know little about. In physics, someone working on string theory or quantum cosmology encounters new riddles daily, such as dark matter or dark energy, whose nature still slips through our grasp. And in the humanities, with so many possible angles of interpretation, reading certain texts can unlock countless interpretive horizons. The positive side of this paradox is that it fosters humility and a permanent sense of curiosity. Individuals moving toward wisdom learn that there's an immense universe left to explore. Even if they come to be references in their domain, they rarely claim ultimate truths. Paraphrasing Socrates, "The only thing I know is that I know nothing," alluding to the immensity of what remains obscure compared to the scant portion one manages to embrace. Whereas the beginner might deceive themselves by believing they know a lot, the seasoned person awakens to the magnitude of the uncharted. Somewhat paradoxically, that recognition enriches one's perspective and fuels progress. If we believed we had discovered everything, research would halt and the growth of knowledge would cease. Not knowing it all propels us to keep asking and to find new viewpoints. It's worth noting that this paradox doesn't argue that acquiring knowledge is fruitless or unreachable. On the contrary, each stage of learning opens doors and refines previous understanding. The paradox lies in how, while our informational foundation grows, the immeasurability of reality also becomes more evident, prompting an attitude of openness and continued inquiry. This perspective is crucial in education, where it's emphasized that mastery of a subject doesn't involve declaring, "I know all there is," but rather advancing confidently into the extensive landscape of the unknown. Practically speaking, the knowledge paradox nudges us to reconcile the will to learn with the awareness that one can always broaden what they know. Realizing this clash may initially feel disheartening, yet rather than seeing it as a verdict of eternal ignorance, it's better to embrace it as motivation. Exploration doesn't end. There's always a next level of detail or a more complex viewpoint to consider. Simultaneously, it teaches us caution in gauging our competence. Such caution frees us from the illusion of omniscience and avoids dogmatism. The upshot is that it's not at all damaging to admit that genuine wisdom, instead of generating a sense of intellectual supremacy, leads to a respectful acknowledgement of how vast the unknown remains. From this angle, the knowledge paradox bolsters the notion that knowledge never truly stops expanding. The farther we go, the more we see how much more is out there to learn. Embracing this fact is tantamount to valuing learning as an endless road. Rather than sowing discouragement, it nourishes a perpetual spark of curiosity. So long as something new can be uncovered, knowledge remains alive and reinvents itself, just like the humble mindset of the person who knows they'll never reach an ultimate endpoint, but will press on, inquiring at every corner their mind can perceive. The tolerance paradox. Karl Popper formulated around the mid-20th century the notion that absolute tolerance, even extended to those who are utterly intolerant, ultimately leads to the destruction of tolerance itself. This argument, which at first sounds contradictory, can be summarized by pointing out that a society willing to accommodate any position, including those that openly advocate repression, censorship, or the eradication of others, inevitably opens the door to forces which, once they gain power, curtail the very liberties that allowed them to flourish. The most extreme examples of this dynamic appeared in certain totalitarian regimes, which, prior to taking control, benefited from freedom and pluralism to disseminate their ideology, and then, upon becoming dominant, deprived everyone else of those same freedoms. The apparent contradiction lies in the fact that, on the one hand, one wishes to respect, to the maximum extent, all opinions and expressions in the name of openness and freedom of thought. On the other, if a specific group preaches the suppression of rights or of diversity, it's nurturing a threat which, if left unchecked, can consolidate and destroy the environment of open debate. This has been seen repeatedly when extremist movements exploit freedom of expression protections to spread their message with the goal of imposing a doctrine that tolerates no dissent. Upon seizing power or dominant influence, they retract the legal safeguards that enabled their ascent and persecute those who disagree. A straightforward case is that of groups defending clearly oppressive stances who simultaneously insist on the right to disseminate their beliefs without limitation. Under a principle of unlimited tolerance, they are shielded. But historically, some of those groups later demanded radical bans and harsh censorship, targeting everyone who doesn't adhere to their ideology. This leaves the society that tolerated them confronting the paradox of seeing how the freedom it once championed has been wiped out. Popper pointed out that for an open and pluralist system to endure, it cannot extend tolerance to people who precisely seek to dismantle that openness and multiplicity. That doesn't imply under any circumstances that the solution is to ban every contrary or radical ideology. Rather, it indicates the need for a practical limit once the expressions and actions of a group are directly aimed at abolishing fundamental rights or inciting violence against others. It's not about suppressing every form of dissent, but about refraining from allowing total freedom for those wishing to eradicate liberties, a course that would erode the system's own underpinnings. Ultimately, absolute tolerance turns naive if it fails to draw a line against individuals determined to reject tolerance as a principle. The classic illustration is a democratic society that confronts a totalitarian or hateful faction. In a liberal democracy, free circulation of ideas is a core trait. However, if a movement emerges proclaiming the demise of democracy or the persecution of minorities or the establishment of an authoritarian regime, supporting it in the name of total freedom will eventually give them enough leeway to dismantle the same democracy and the protection of rights. Hence, the dilemma is being tolerant of everything versus the need to impose limits on those who aim to abolish tolerance itself. The events of the 20th century serve as testimony. Extremist movements rose to prominence through the liberties at hand, then, having gained power, dismantled them. Thus, the tolerance paradox is mitigated or resolved by accepting that, in order to protect coexistence, that same society may, and at times must, restrain those discourses or forces that push for violence or the total suppression of others' liberties. Failing to do so, Popper maintained, would be a slow suicide of tolerance, since intolerance's champions would grow under the auspices of an open environment, only to shut it down afterward. Put differently, acknowledging that tolerance can't be limitless underscores that maintaining a plural environment calls for certain regulatory constraints. This might, for instance, mean penalizing calls for genocide or thoroughly quashing democracy without labeling it as unfair repression, but rather as self-preservation of tolerance. Some people object that such a measure risks labeling any severe criticism or unpopular stance as intolerant. That's why it's important to clarify that Popper's theory focuses on cases in which liberties are used to set up, eventually, a repressive regime. It's not about silencing mere disagreement. The debate, then, is about finding equilibrium. How far do we let ideas circulate? And at what point does a discourse threaten the very essence of freedom and diversity? It's a complex predicament since it involves deciding who draws that line and how, without committing abuses. Essentially, this paradox reveals the fragility of absolute freedom without safeguards. The desire to be fully open and tolerant of everything must acknowledge the reality that if an intolerant group grows influential, the openness it enjoyed might be eradicated. In other words, extreme tolerance toward the intolerant can lead to the demise of the very pluralism on which it rests. Historical examples exist of violent ideologies exploiting that leeway to institute dictatorships or rigid systems of control, confirming that a lack of counterbalance can lead to destroying tolerance itself. By way of conclusion, reflecting on the tolerance paradox highlights a free society's responsibility to shield itself from internal forces bent on undermining it. This doesn't form an indefensible moral contradiction. Real tolerance isn't a blank check for those wanting to eradicate it. Specifying and activating legal or social means to block the spread of individuals intent on attacking core values is a necessary task. It might be disheartening to realize we can't innocently afford to be tolerant of everything, but such a practical realization underpins safeguarding collective rights. The tolerance paradox, in the end, shows how critical it is to have limits that defend openness and coexistence against projects that would feed off that openness to wipe it out. Consequently, it underscores the need to avoid the naive belief that, by being tolerant, we can simply allow all speech that aims to destroy tolerance itself. If we don't protect it, we risk losing it at the hands of those preaching absolute intolerance. Moravec's paradox. Within the challenges of artificial intelligence and robotics, there is a paradox formulated by Hans Moravec that essentially states the following: tasks that come easily to humans, walking, recognizing faces, handling objects, turn out to be highly complicated to program in a robot or computerized system, whereas tasks often considered difficult on an intellectual level, like solving complex equations or playing chess at a high level, are much more accessible from a computational standpoint. Put more simply, the paradox suggests that what appears easy for humans is difficult for machines, and what seems arduous for humans becomes easier for a computer. This observation arises from experience accumulated in the development of AI through the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st. It was discovered, for example, that it was relatively straightforward to equip a computer with the capacity to process enormous databases, carry out astronomical calculations in fractions of a second, or beat a grandmaster at chess. Yet it was extremely difficult to make a robot navigate a dynamic environment without bumping into things or recognize objects in images as naturally as a child. Early in AI history, many believed that once machines achieved success in high-level intellectual tasks, they would easily master everyday abilities, but the opposite occurred. It's striking that something as simple as walking involves a highly refined motor control and constant sensory feedback processing that we humans have performed from a young age without thinking twice about it. A small child can dodge obstacles, keep balance, react to uneven terrain, all thanks to a blend of biological evolution and subconscious learning. However, in robotics, each one of those adjustments demands complex mathematical models, specialized sensors, and real-time control algorithms, which still present major hurdles. The same holds for facial recognition or natural language comprehension. They're so deeply ingrained in our human evolution that we experience them as natural, yet reproducing them in an artificial system requires vast computational power and ongoing refinements in vision or language processing algorithms. On the other hand, activities like chess, strongly associated with high-level reasoning, turn out to be easier for a machine because they rely on calculations of positions and moves that can be modeled with logic and brute force computation. If you give a computer a method to evaluate millions of possible positions per second, alongside a solid heuristic, it can surpass even world champions. Meanwhile, that same robot able to beat a grandmaster might struggle to walk down a hallway without tripping over a chair. This apparent contradiction can be explained in light of evolution. The human brain, shaped over millions of years, has achieved an extremely refined command of motor and perceptual functions, so they pose no conscious effort to us. In contrast, the more advanced sorts of abstract thinking, such as that needed for certain mathematical challenges, are relatively recent in human evolutionary history, and it's not so profoundly integrated into our biological structure. Thus, designing algorithms that handle enormous numerical operations or that play chess has turned out to be more straightforward. You model the task, feed in specific rules, than replicating something seemingly trivial, like a child's effortless ability to handle a ball. The practical result of Moravec's paradox is that many early predictions about AI and robotics were flawed. Back in the 1960s, it was assumed that after teaching machines to reason with formal logic, giving them everyday skills would be trivial. Yet even now it remains a significant challenge to have a domestic robot fold clothes or mop the floor with the dexterity of a human. Conversely, we've seen dramatic progress in AI in areas such as big data analysis, statistical pattern recognition in vast databases, and simulation of chess matches, arenas where logic and computational muscle excel. A revealing example is humanoid robotics. Substantial sums have been invested in prototypes that emulate a human figure and gait. However, we've yet to see a robot move through various settings with the ease and efficiency of a child learning to walk. Every sensor must process data in real time. Each joint requires constant equilibrium calculations, and adapting to uneven surfaces or environmental shifts remains problematic. Meanwhile, in the realm of high-level logic, machines progress rapidly. This contrast shines a light on the gap between what seems natural to humans and what is realistically easy for a computer. From a reflective standpoint, the paradox underscores the asymmetry between what we consider difficult in an abstract or mathematical sense and what is difficult from the perspective of artificial intelligence. Many capabilities that the brain handles automatically were polished by evolution, involving complex networks of sensory systems and neurons that handle balance, perception, object manipulation, or interpreting visual and auditory signals. For a machine, reproducing those abilities with near-human naturalness demands enormous resources and sophisticated algorithmic hardware design. Yet numeric and combinatorial operations that humans perceive as a major intellectual challenge, like deeply exploring moves in a chess game, are well aligned with a digital system's binary architecture and computational speed. Far from a mere anecdote, Moravec's paradox calls for recalibrating our assumptions about AI. Merely programming a computer to solve advanced mathematical problems is not enough to produce a robot with human-like everyday skills. That implies acknowledging that many tasks we view as trivial are underpinned by highly elaborate mechanisms refined by evolution. One of the critical frontiers in AI indeed involves cognitive robotics and computer vision, training a machine to understand its physical environment, detect objects, navigate without collisions, grasp tools deftly, or adapt to unforeseen events that a human brain handles as routine reflexes. In practice, this paradox suggests that advances in robotics and AI challenge our basic presumptions about the complexity of different tasks. Programmers routinely discover that concerns like recognize this fruit and move around the room without bumping into anything demand tremendous research efforts, whereas calculations that humans find overwhelming, like projecting a chess line 15 moves ahead, are relatively straightforward for a digital system. Moravec reminds us that what is intuitive for a human can be extremely difficult to systematize, while what is daunting for our abstract reasoning is often more natural for a digital processor's binary logic and computing prowess. Ultimately, the lesson lies in recognizing that human intelligence, shaped by evolution for survival in a physical environment teeming with stimuli and social interaction, differs substantially from the formal logic or brute force calculation that machines handle. This doesn't negate the achievements of AI, but it does temper expectations. It's insufficient to master high-level computation to produce a robot capable of routine daily tasks. Essentially, Moravec's paradox exposes the gulf between motor perceptual intelligence and logical mathematical intelligence, and how that gap continues to shape the robotics race to achieve the effortless naturalness humans display without even noticing. Service recovery paradox. The service recovery paradox is a striking phenomenon in the world of customer experience and hospitality, suggesting that when a service failure is handled exceptionally well, it can lead to greater customer satisfaction and loyalty than if no error had occurred at all. At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. If a company's mistakes cause inconvenience or frustration, how could that ever outperform a scenario in which everything had gone right from the start? Yet real-life cases repeatedly show that under specific conditions, a redeemed failure can become a positive anchor in customers' memories, sometimes transforming an initially negative incident into a distinguishing factor that fosters trust and loyalty. To understand this paradox thoroughly, imagine a scenario in which a traveler arrives at a hotel late in the evening, exhausted from a flight. Upon checking in, the traveler finds that their room is unavailable due to overbooking or a clerical error. Ordinarily, this situation would spark annoyance or anger, the very definition of poor service, made worse by the timing. The fundamental transaction of a hotel stay is disrupted. A guaranteed room is not, in fact, available. If the situation remained unresolved or handled with indifference, the guest would undoubtedly leave with a very negative opinion. But suppose instead that the staff swiftly and genuinely apologizes, takes swift responsibility, upgrades the guest to a better room or partner property, arranges complimentary transport, and offers a personal note or small gift to ease the inconvenience. The traveler, initially upset, ends up feeling taken care of on a deeper level than if they had just received a standard room problem-free. The memory of the painful check-in transforms into a tale of how they made it right. This is precisely the crux of the service recovery paradox. The customer's sense of gratitude or relief can exceed what they would have felt if there had been no slip-up in the first place. The turning point in the story is not the mistake itself, but the way it is resolved, with speed, authenticity, empathy, and often an extra gesture of goodwill. It is not enough to rectify the error with lukewarm courtesy or half-hearted gestures. Only an impressive and sincere recovery is likely to yield that lift in satisfaction. In other words, the paradox emerges when the resolution goes well above typical standards of apology, making the customer feel truly valued. Although examples of the service recovery paradox abound, it is crucial to clarify that not every mistake leads to this beneficial bounce if resolved. In some instances, the damage is too severe, or the error is handled too casually, leaving the client with a poor impression. The paradox is contingent on the resolution being so adept that it replaces the frustration with a sense of genuine concern and personal care. When customers witness staff going the extra mile, they experience a sense of partnership with the business. They think, "This place truly cares and solved my issue with sincerity," which can cement a stronger bond than the typical scenario with no problem at all. The service recovery paradox, however, does not imply that a business should deliberately create mishaps or that every customer meltdown can be turned into an advantage. Repeated or large-scale failures are unlikely to produce any net positive effect, given that trust would erode with each new incident. Customers might tolerate and be delighted by the resolution of a rare incidental slip, but if failures appear routine or manipulative, the effect vanishes swiftly. A single well-handled problem might inspire loyalty. Multiple repeated problems, no matter how well the staff tries to fix them, begin to suggest systemic incompetence or cynicism. Thus, the paradox only holds under specific conditions: a sporadic or unexpected error, a heartfelt and thorough reaction, and a willingness by the customer to give the company a chance. Moreover, the psychological underpinnings revolve around emotion and memory. People rarely recall flawless service experiences in detail. Everything just went smoothly, so little stands out. By contrast, an unexpected obstacle that's resolved beyond expectations stirs more emotional intensity. We remember the pivot from annoyance to relief, from anger to gratitude, more vividly than a service that was simply fine from beginning to end. In effect, the neural pathways of emotional engagement become stronger when we go through a brief negative dip, followed by a powerful upswing, turning that incident into a story worth telling. This phenomenon explains, in part, why certain extraordinary resolutions remain in our minds for years, while many impeccably executed stays, flights, or meals fade into oblivion soon after they finish. From a managerial perspective, acknowledging the service recovery paradox promotes training staff in empathy, authority to correct issues, and a protocol of surpassing expectations when a slip occurs. The intention is not to orchestrate crises, but to cultivate readiness. Employees should feel empowered to upgrade a dissatisfied traveler or swiftly replace a spoiled dish at a restaurant with an added free dessert as a show of goodwill. This swift compensation or upgrading is meant to convey, "We value your trust so highly that we want you to leave happier than ever, despite our mistake." The psychological effect of witnessing the company act with concern and generosity fosters a sense that the brand genuinely invests in the client's satisfaction, forging a sense of loyalty deeper than if there had been no glitch in the first place. Yet, one must not overlook the risks. A business that grows complacent, believing that errors can be redeemed to create loyal fans, will likely see more problems than successful resolutions. The overhead in time, resources, and staff training is significant. Moreover, some errors are so grave that no amount of wow factor can soothe a client's anger: a catastrophic flight cancellation, severe food poisoning, or repeated health code infractions. In these cases, trust collapses. Additionally, there is a fine line between taking advantage of the paradox and delivering authentic solutions. Customers can usually sense if a reparation is a sincere attempt at restitution or a perfunctory gesture. The concept extends beyond commerce and can be applied to personal relationships or co-worker interactions as well. If someone close to us commits a mistake or oversight and then invests genuine care into making amends, maybe with a heartfelt apology, visible changes in behavior, a sincere explanation, we may come out trusting them more than if no incident had happened. The feeling that they value me enough to rectify this wholeheartedly can be a potent glue in human connections, just like in client-company links. This underscores the paradox's universal dimension. Well-executed recoveries from conflict can sometimes bolster a bond more than a conflict-free relationship. However, not everyone experiences this effect in the same way. Some individuals, once disappointed, remain cold to gestures of amends. Their trust crumbles and no miraculous fix can restore it. Others can be more forgiving, so long as the reparation resonates with them personally. The paradox rests on the notion that if the remedy is truly superior to what the customer or counterpart expected, the negative memory morphs into an extraordinary anecdote. They messed up my reservation, but they more than made up for it. That story becomes emblematic of a sense of they truly went above and beyond. In summary, the service recovery paradox revolves around the counterintuitive discovery that, on certain occasions, a service failure, when resolved with remarkable care and empathy, can leave clients feeling more satisfied than if they'd faced no issue at all. It relies on emotional contrast, on that shift from frustration to relief, and on perceiving a real commitment to making things right. Of course, it is not a strategy a business would choose to deploy intentionally. Rather, it is an outcome that arises when mistakes inevitably happen and are turned into opportunities to showcase the authenticity and dedication of the service provider. By comprehending the paradox and preparing employees and protocols to handle issues swiftly and graciously, organizations and even individuals can harness negative situations to cultivate a stronger loyalty and deeper trust than would have arisen from an experience that was merely problem-free from the beginning.